Hello Postman Minds! Welcome to the vacuum I inhabit. Today I have a very interesting story for you. It is a story of treason and betrayal. It is a story of struggle and duty. Of doing what you know is right, even though you know it doesn't seem so. It is the story of Hattusili III, the great king of the Hittite Empire. If I told you the outline of this story, you might think that you already know it. It is the story of a great king, loved by his people, that dies one day. But don't worry, this great king has an heir, a child that he has been preparing his whole life to take his place and serve his people. But the king had a brother, the uncle of the prince, who was always at the shadow of his brother. And now that his nephew is on the throne, he sees this as the perfect opportunity to seize power all for himself. The prince, of course, escapes, and years later manages to gather supporters of the legitimate heir of the throne, and so he starts a rebellion against his evil uncle. And in all other stories, the prince would win. But here, he loses, and his evil uncle rules until his last day. But this is not the story of the prince. Hattusili is actually the uncle. And he knew he looked like the bad guy. He knew how we would tell this story. And so he decided to tell it himself. He decided to write the story of his life in what we think that is the first autobiography in history. And the people who first translated this autobiography were surprised to find that Hattusili even apologizes for everything that happened. He tries to explain that he had no other choice. And so, this is known as Hattusili's apology. And you can go read it by yourself. Links in the description. But before I tell you the story of Hattusili, first I have to tell you what was the kingdom that he was born to serve. One of the few things you probably remember from history class, besides that one time the teacher came with a camel toe, is that the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians were some of the first civilizations. What you probably don't remember though is that the Hittites appeared some centuries afterwards. And they came out of nowhere. Seriously, we have no idea where they came from. But they appeared one day guided by their legendary king Labarna, and they just kicked ass across Anatolia, and from there they spent several centuries conquering and expanding until the Hittite nation was a rival to both Egypt and Mesopotamia. But the interesting part is that, unlike the Egyptians or the Assyrians, the Hittites didn't build great monuments to honor their gods or their kings, even though they could have. In their temples we don't find preserved kings nor fancy paintings. In their temples we find food recipes, we find contracts, we find administrative documents. In fact, the first ever document that we managed to translate from their language was a beer and bread recipe. So the Hittites were like the Germans of the Bronze Age. You have no idea how true that is. And so, now that we have set our stage as this rich but modest kingdom, let's begin with our story. Hattusili tells us that he was born a son of Mursili II. And Mursili II is a very interesting character in his own right. But today all that matters is that he had 4 children. Halpashulupi, Mashanausi, Muwatalis, and finally Hattusili. And yeah, I know they have very weird names, but in all honesty, your name would probably sound very weird to them. Jessica. Halpashulupi had a very stupid name, so he died. And Mashanausi had a very awesome name, but she did nothing with her life. So all we care about is Muwatalis and Hattusili. Muwatalis became the heir of his father when his older brother Halpashulupi died. And everyone thought that Hattusili would die too, because he was very weak and sicklish. But Hattusili tells us that one day his father had a dream. In this dream he had a vision of Ishtar, the goddess of sex and war. Which, when you think about it, is a very awesome combination. Anyway, in the dream, Ishtar told Mursili that the only way that Hattusili wouldn't die in childhood was if he became a priest for her. And so Hattusili was sent to priest school. Not preschool, priest school. And you have to understand that being a priest back then was very different from being a priest today. It was a cross between being a government official, having a degree from a university, and actually being a priest with sacred duties. And it worked. Hattusili went from being this sicklish child to becoming an intelligent statesman and a brave warrior. Think of it as a transformation from Hiccup in How to Train Your Dragon to Hiccup in How to Train Your Dragon 3. And he also became very devout of Ishtar. Like, seriously, he doesn't shut up about her. He's like the Ned Flanders of the Bronze Age. Except Jesus commands his followers to forgive their enemies and love everyone, while Ishtar commands her followers to acquire more beauty and power. So, yeah, nothing like Ned Flanders. Then, one day, Mursili II died, and his son, Muwatallis I, took the throne. And here something very interesting happened. Because while Muwatallis was the great king of the whole nation, he decided to name Hattusili the small king of the north. And he then gave Hattusili the control of the capital city of Hattusa, moving the new capital to a city in the south. This meant that effectively each brother was ruling one half of the empire. Hattusili was to rule and develop the core of the nation, and Muwatallis was to expand it, conquering the rich cities of Mesopotamia. But this plan didn't work, because soon after moving the capital, a huge rebellion started. And Hattusili doesn't tell us why, but he tells us that this rebellion destroyed several cities, and it seems that for a while, the Hittite nation was in the brink of collapse. Luckily, Hattusili managed to intercept the rebel army and engage them in battle, and he claims that he himself managed to kill the rebel general, and this made his army fall apart. Muwatallis and Hattusili spent the next few weeks defeating the last pockets of resistance. But immediately afterwards, they were invaded by Egypt, who was ruled back then by Ramses II. Ramses had seen that the Hittite nation was weak, and so he decided that this was the time to strike and conquer all the cities they had in the coast of the Mediterranean. Muwatallis and Hattusili gathered their troops and started marching south to meet the Egyptian forces, and they met them in the city of Kadesh. Now, much has been said about the Battle of Kadesh, and it deserves its own video. But the short version is this. If someone tells you that the Battle of Kadesh was a decisive Egyptian victory, that person is wrong, because if it had been a decisive Egyptian victory, they would have continued north, conquering more. Instead, they went south, back to their country, and they even lost territory. So it wasn't a decisive Egyptian victory. After all of these battles, Hattusili went to a temple dedicated to Ishtar to give thanks. And here he met another priestess of Ishtar, a woman who was also a very big fan of this goddess. And so they geeked out about Ishtar, and then they fell in love, and they got married. They had crushed the rebellion, they had stopped the Egyptian invasion, he was married, life was good with Hattusili. And so Hattusili and his wife Puluhepa started working to heal the nation after all of those wars. For example, they started rebuilding many of the cities that had been destroyed. They gathered many refugees and settled them to create new cities. He even rebuilt the sacred city of Nerik that had been destroyed decades ago during the reign of his father. And the people loved him for this. And he, of course, was the de facto ruler of all of these new cities. But, alas, all good things must come to an end. And so Hattusili's older brother Muwatallis died, and he died rather young. But they were prepared for this situation, because even though Muwatallis hadn't had children with his wife, he had had children with several concubines. And one of these kids, called Urheteshub, had been chosen to be his successor. And Muwatallis had trained him all his life to be a king. Now, being the son of a concubine, his claim of the throne was rather weak, but his uncle Hattusili supported him. Sadly for everyone, Muwatallis did a terrible job training this kid to be a king, because he turned out to be very insecure. When Urheteshub took the throne, he probably looked at his uncle. Always a small king, never a great king. And yet, the armies were loyal to Hattusili. The people loved Hattusili. But Urheteshub hadn't rebuilt any cities. he hadn't won any battles. And so he forgot the trust that Muwatallis had on his brother. He forgot how Muwatallis had given him half the nation to rule. And so Urhiteshub took all the generals that had served under Hattusili and he just sent them away to defend remote fortresses in the frontiers of the empire. As for Hattusili himself, he lost all of his titles. He was no longer the small king of the north. He was no longer a general of the army and he ruled only 2 cities. But Hattusili accepted all of this. After all, these were the orders of his king. And so, for 7 years, Hattusili ruled only the 2 cities that his king had ordered him to rule. Until one day, a letter came. It was a letter from the king. And in this letter, Urhiteshub was taking these last 2 cities from Hattusili. Hattusili had had enough, and so he sent a reply to the king. A reply that said, and I'm quoting from the translation, "You defy me, you are the great king, while I am only king of the cities you have left me. And so, come, and let Ishtar of Shamuha and the god of Nerik judge us." In modern English, that would be something like this. "You want my cities, motherfucker? Come and take them." As the news of Hattusili's rebellion spread, all the generals that had been dismissed by Urhiteshub came and swore loyalty to Hattusili. And so his newly formed army started marching towards the capital, Hattusa. When Hattusili reached Hattusa, he found that his nephew wasn't there. He had sealed himself in a fortress, and sadly he doesn't tell us how he defeated his nephew. Maybe he just surrounded the fortress and waited for hunger to defeat him. Or maybe many of the soldiers there had served under Hattusili and were loyal to him, and so they simply switched sides and they opened the gates of the fortress. Who knows? What we know is that Hattusili took the throne, declared himself great king, and he made Urhiteshub ruler of a few cities near the border. Eventually, Urhiteshub gathered supporters and he made a rebellion of his own, but he was defeated again. After which he was sent to live in an island. And so Hattusili and Puluhepa ruled the Hittite Empire for many decades. And in all these years, there were no major wars, and they continued with their efforts to build more infrastructure and cities and roads. But their crown achievement has to be the signing of the first peace treaty in history between the Hittite Empire and the Egyptians, the 2 most powerful nations of the time. And this treaty was also a mutual defense agreement. And when the Hittites were attacked several decades later, Egypt did came to aid them. It was called the Perpetual Peace, and it lasted as long as those nations lasted. So, pretty perpetual to me. And so, the Hittite Empire prospered and thrived for 100 years, until it was destroyed during the Bronze Age collapse. And we still don't know what happened. We still don't know what took to bring down such a nation. But even if this nation was eventually destroyed, their legacy lives on. Today, in the United Nations, they have a copy of the Treaty of Eternal Peace, to remind them that the effort of diplomacy started a long time ago. And in his autobiography, Hattusili mentions the battles he fought, but he doesn't give many detail on them. On the contrary, he gives a lot of detail of the cities he built, of the refugees he settled, because for him it was more important to build than to conquer. And the first chance he got, it was more important to him to have peace than to have victory. That's something that we ought to learn from him. And for all of these reasons, and many more, I think that Hattusili III is the most amazing king that you have probably never heard of. Thanks a lot for watching. If you like, please subscribe and give a like, and if you want more videos, I have some suggestions over here. Also, you can now find me in all social media. Except Pinterest, because I don't get it. It's for weddings or something. But I mean Facebook and Twitter and him in YouTube, and that's it.